ado, I would really like to introduce two lovely colleagues of mine, Stephen Keast, Keasty, and Debra, Panizzon, Deb, who will be holding the floor with you for the next hour and giving plenty of time for your questions and responses to some recent work they've been doing. It's out of a big grant they've won and exploring teachers' pedagogical reasoning. So I'll hand over to them to explain that to you and enjoy.
Thank you. Let's just see if we can get the PowerPoint to work. Don't clap yet, we haven't done anything. Excellent. That's a good start, we've got the PowerPoint up. Thank you. First, I'd just like to acknowledge a few people. John Locker and Ian Mitchell have been the co-researchers with Deb and I think that's really important that we acknowledge their work as well. Mel and Lucy have been my research assistants. It's great to see them here today. And Kathy Smith, where's Kathy? She's sitting here somewhere. She's also been working on our project as well. So it's been a bit of a team effort and we don't want to take all the credit. Professional wisdom of practice. It's an interesting concept. And I think in teaching sometimes it's not well recognised what professional wisdom of practice means. One of the things we wanted to look at was what is the sort of thinking behind the way teachers plan their lessons when they're expert teachers. Not just anybody, but experts. And this project came out of some work that had been ongoing for 4 or 5 years on a voluntary program where teachers wanted to come in and share what they called their pedagogical purposes, which we have renamed more to the literature in terms of pedagogical reasoning. They called it secret teachers' business because when they tried to share the reasoning behind their teaching, the students hadn't thought that there was any purpose behind it. The teachers didn't sit down and think about why they were planning their lessons and what they hoped to get out of it. They just saw it as separate activities. So we wanted to sort of capture what this might be. We started with Schulman in 1987. He gave a really important address to the American Education Research Association conference. It's one of the biggest conferences in the world for education. And at the time there was some things going on in American education where teacher education itself was being undermined because there was two schools of thought. One school of thought was that if you know pedagogy...
What's up?
Oh, excellent. If you know pedagogy and you understand how to teach, you can teach anything. The other school of thought was if you're an expert in your field, you could be a teacher. So Schulman said, no, that's not the case. There is expertise in teaching. The expert history teacher has different knowledge to the expert science teacher. And the expert science teacher has different knowledge to the expert scientist. The expert science teacher has different knowledge. They know how to teach, but they know how to teach their area. So he proposed 7 domains of teacher knowledge. They were content knowledge, and he said that was important, but it wasn't the only focus. He said there was general pedagogical knowledge, that is, how do we teach, knowing the strategies of teaching. He said there was pedagogical content knowledge, and a lot of people have jumped on this idea of pedagogical content knowledge. It is the intersection between general knowledge and content, how to teach a particular topic well. Yes?
Is this PowerPoint presentation going to be available on the website?
Yes, I'll make sure it is. No worries. So, this special intersection between general pedagogical knowledge and content knowledge. So how you might teach states of matter to year 7 is very different to how you might teach it to year 10. And the things that you might do with it and the boundaries you put on it, they're all special. And that's different to how you might teach electricity to year 7 because it's a different content. And how expert teachers understand that is important. Curriculum knowledge, knowledge of learners and their characteristics, knowledge of educational contexts, and knowledge of educational purposes and values and their philosophies. So he put together these 7 areas of knowledge. A lot of research has been carried out on pedagogical content knowledge. Okay. So Anne, shall I just go down? Across? that it? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've found was, Schulman said, pedagogical reasoning was the enactment of the decisions made by teachers through their pedagogical reasoning. So one of the issues was PCK has offered so much, this idea that we can unpack how to teach, say, states of matter to Year 7s is really important. But it's also very personal, and it's also very tacit. The expert knowledge that teachers have is really hard to articulate and hard to draw out. In fact, what we've found far more useful is unpacking their pedagogical reasoning. This idea of how they think about what they plan. Because pedagogical reasoning actually shows... missing a slide, I think, doesn't matter. Pedagogical reasoning is actually the enactment of teacher knowledge. So when we see their pedagogical reasoning, they actually enact those other 7 things in the way they develop their classes and their planning. And so we wanted to try and capture what pedagogical reasoning was. We thought from our other project that this could be an opportunity to really get to what makes the knowledge of an expert science teacher. And so we were only interested in expert science teachers in this project. When we went back and had a look at what Schulman proposed in terms of pedagogical reasoning, he said, and he was talking about English teachers, but he said they start with a text, and any text, but he thought all teachers start with some form of text, and he said text could be like a science concept as well, okay? But that you needed to understand what that concept was. So your first job as a teacher was to comprehend what it was you needed to teach. And then he said you have to transform it into knowledge for students. Then you have to make it instruction. So how are you going to teach it? And then you should do an evaluation. And then you should do reflection. And then from reflection comes new comprehensions of that knowledge. And so it feeds back into the top. So next time you teach it, you start again from the knowledge you've learnt from teaching it this time. He very much said that professional practice or wisdom of practice comes from actually doing the teaching, and that's really important. So this sounds very logical, that when we sit down to plan, we comprehend, we transform, and then we build instruction. For me, I'm only interested in the first 3 in terms of pedagogical reasoning. I see the last 3 as part of reflective practice. There's been a lot of research around reflective practice. And I think it's confusing to put reflective practice in with pedagogical reasoning, given the large body of knowledge around reflective practice already in the literature. So I'm really focused on the first 3. The other thing Schulman said that was quite interesting was that teachers tend to work through these as a cycle. Okay, they tend to work through them from top to bottom. They start with comprehension and they work through.
It's me.
That's you. Go.
Okay, so with that theoretical background for the project, we move on to what our project was actually based upon. So clearly we're looking at expert teachers, and we were looking at expert teachers in science, whether that be secondary or primary. So we collected 40, we were lucky enough to work with the Catholic Education Office in Melbourne, and we collected 40 teachers to work with over a 3-year period. 20 of those approximately were primary teachers and 20 were secondary. We thought it was really important to have both groups of teachers and the continuity between those sort of represented in our sample. We then, and what we're really wanting to do is, as Keast just reinforced, is that this was about their planning. So as they sat down as a team, what was going through their heads in trying to plan and prepare to teach rather than after they had taught. So trying to get that tacit knowledge that we know that expert teachers have that make teaching look so easy. When my pre-service teachers go to see a good teacher working in the classroom, they make it look easy. But it's easy because they have done a lot of work before they've actually got there. So it's about trying to pull that out. So 3 years, in 2014 we started with cohort 1, our first group of 20 teachers. We then, 2015, we maintained cohort 1. So while we worked with them in the first year, we actually gave them an introduction to what pedagogical reasoning was, a little bit about our research project, and we were working together, and a lot of that was workshop type activities. So it wasn't about us standing around, it was about us all getting together and lots of examples of good practice and them unpacking what the pedagogical reasoning was. In 2015, that group of teachers then went back into their schools and became leaders of pedagogical reasoning within their school. And for each group of teachers, that took on their own way of working in their particular school. For some of the teachers, they would go into their school and they may have only worked with another 2 or 3 teachers. Some teachers may have only worked with another 1 teacher. It really varied. In some schools, the whole science faculty got on board, the whole science team got on board. But what we did do in 2015 is we took on another cohort. So we have 2 cohorts running simultaneously in 2015. It was a big year. It was a busy year. In it should have been 16. I got that, my numbers, I've missed a year. So in 2016, cohort 1 now are not working with us, but but they're writing. So they're actually writing about their professional reasoning, and we're trying to capture that. Meanwhile, cohort 2 have now gone into that leadership. So they're working with us, and we're now helping them to look at how they can lead this in their own schools. So what did the teachers actually do? What did we expect them to do? So firstly, within the first year that they worked with us, they had 5 days of actually coming and working with us at the Catholic Education Office, doing all this kind of interesting stuff. In the second year, they had another 3 days. So overall with us, they've had 8 days. In the writing phase, they're still having days where they're coming in and working with the team and whoever's around just to help them work on their synthesis of their ideas. But what they had to do in between our meetings is quite a bit of work. So they were all given a digital recorder, which they thought was pretty fantastic, and were somewhat intimidated by it initially when we said, when you sit down and you're talking with other teachers about planning your work, put the recorder on, right? Simple instruction, but it was a little bit hard initially because there is so much conversation that goes on in that banter between one person and another, questioning, answers, exploration, that we wanted to have that captured. So now we have what's normally going through an expert teacher's head out, being verbalised. We had all those recordings uploaded onto Dropbox, and Mel and Lucy had the job of kind of putting those together and teasing them out and sorting things out. It was a huge amount of material. It still is there. And then we went through and analysed it in particular ways. In between time, Kathy went out and was conducting interviews with teachers just to pick up some of the what are you doing back in the school, etc. It was great having Kathy on the team because Kathy had a relationship with these teachers. So whereas we, less so me, but the other members of the team had quite a long-standing relationship with a lot of the teachers, Kathy was the person who they knew the most. So there was already that rapport with Kathy. Okay, so coming out of that, there were 5 focal concepts that sort of emerged when we started to have a look at all the data and to kind of categorise it and put it in and to group it. Now remember, we are talking about science, so it will be a little bit, it may be, if you're here from another subject area, which is fantastic, you need to kind of think about what that might look like in history, what that looks like in English, etc. So big ideas: student engagement, quality learning and quality learners, contextual constraints and opportunities, and the last one, the personal and professional identity of teachers, was interesting because that really started to emerge for us by the end of the first year, where we saw, there's something else that's emerging here as we had gone on working with these teachers. So what I'm just going to do fairly briefly is just to talk about just a little bit of information about some of these. Some of them are self-explanatory, for example, like contextual constraints and opportunities, and just a little bit of an insight as to some of the findings that sort of have come out and areas of real interest for us in working with these teachers and for them as well. So first of all, big ideas. As a science person, I'm really comfortable with the notion of a big idea. So I won't read it for you because you're competent readers. So you can, if you just have a read of the slide. So it's that notion of stepping back from all the little bits that we have in science. I'm a biology teacher. Biology is fraught with bits of stuff that students need to learn. And they feel they need to learn it off by heart. So it's just endless bits of stuff, definitions to learn. So, but for myself, I have forgotten a lot of the minute details of some of the content. But what I have got, I think, is I carry around a lot of big ideas in my head where I'm connecting things that are really important, and I have got the underlying thing that makes everything else work for that particular concept that I'm talking about. So just a biological example, of course, we might take something like a textbook definition of a heterotroph and an autotroph. So heterotrophs, organisms that derive nutritional nutrients by taking in complex organic substances. And autotrophs, of course, can synthesise and manufacture their own, plants. So some teachers would say that a big idea is you just look at a textbook and you just get the topic, and that's a big idea. That's not how we would conceive a big idea. It's more connected than that. But if you have a look at the second one, that's a really good big idea. One group of living organisms uses the sun's energy to make food that all living things depend on for energy and therefore their existence. I would have biology students, I reckon there would be first year biology students who would do lots of stuff about ecosystems but would not get to that understanding of what an ecosystem is all about. It's about energy moving through that system. And no matter how many definitions you give them, they won't necessarily get that. Okay, so what was interesting for us with big ideas was that it caused incredible contention because the primary teachers had quite a different view of a big idea, which was absolutely fantastic. We don't have time to share all that information, but for me, I suppose that was, for me, was the most exciting finding that sort of happened, and it was about getting those teachers to talk about why and how they perceived big ideas. Okay, the second focal concept was student engagement. This is pretty self-explanatory. We want to engage students. Get students engaged and you can keep them in the palm of your hands. Doesn't matter what year level they are, including university students. They like to be engaged as well. When we talk about engagement, when we sifted through what the teachers were talking about, how they were planning their lessons, remember, we could see examples of cognitive engagement, affective engagement, metacognitive, and the agentic, which is about, I never get this one. Agency, yeah, which is about students having control.
That's right.
Yes. Okay, so they all were very evident in the things that teachers were talking about in their planning. The next one was quality learning and quality learners. Not surprising. The expert teachers would often think about talking with their students about the learning. So it was not about them doing to, but it was about students being part of the whole learning process. They had a shared language about what they were doing and what was happening. It gave students then intellectual control of what was going on in the classroom because they actually understood. It wasn't this kind of bizarre thing that they had to try and navigate or a whisper, try and guess what's in the teacher's head that was happening. And the other thing that emerged very, very strongly was that expert teachers have what Claxton called split screen thinking. So when expert teachers are working in that classroom and working with their students, they are able to take their content, they know their content and think about their content, but at the same time, simultaneously, they're thinking about the learning. They're not separated. That's not what I see when I see, and I talk to a lot of my pre-service teachers. They're not there yet, right? They're novices. But that's what expert teachers do, and it's automatic for them. Constraints and opportunities. every teacher, every one of us will know that in our working environment, there are things that inhibit us from doing things. And while some people will say, oh, time's a problem, such and such is a problem, I can't do this, something else is happening, we've got this, these expert teachers usually find ways around the obstacles. And when they're planning, they will say, oh, but they'll have this, but maybe we could do it like this. So instead of it becoming the obstacle being a roadblock, they just see it as blink, don't worry about it, and we find ways around that. We circumnavigate that. And Keasty.
Okay.
Keasty's going to put it together.
Okay. So I want to just go back over the focal concepts for a minute and explain. This idea of big ideas is really important because it's not, as we said, the topic headings. And one of the favourite ones for me is about physics, because I'm not a biologist. Autotrophs and heterotrophs don't help me at all. But
They should.
they should. What helps me was thinking about something that I've taught a lot, and that was Newton's laws of motion. And one of Newton's laws says for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And yet often when that's drawn, there's drawn as two arrows on the one object. And that's not really how it is at all. But if we think about what the concept really is about, that there's some sort of distortion at the point of impact. So as I'm walking around this floor, I'm trying to push down on the floor, and as I'm pushing down, the floor is giving a little bit, and as it gives, the particles there push back on my feet, and that's what stops me falling through the floor. Now that's interesting because I can do some simple demonstrations to show how that works, because the kids will say, oh, but what does that mean? You know, show me what it looks like. And I can set up a ruler between a couple of books, and I can put a book on it and the ruler bends. Put another book on it, bends a bit more. And they can actually see this bending of the ruler. And I've had students say then, well, that's okay, but if I'm walking on a concrete floor, I don't feel it bend. So is it bending? And Ian and I were thinking about this at one stage going, oh, how do you try and counter that, you know, this bending of a concrete? And we're thinking, but have you ever been on the bridge over a freeway and you're sitting there in your car and you're waiting to turn and you hear the trucks go past and you can feel in your car that the bridge is moving, you know? And that opens up conversations so that kids can take this science idea and actually look for examples in the real world. It makes it real to them. And then we were talking about this and somebody came back and said, oh, kid came back into class and said, I was on a trampoline on the weekend. It really got to me that here I was bending the trampoline's taking it up and then pushing back, you know? So having some way, a big idea is more than the content heading. It's more than the name, you know, it lets you in. And that's what we're really looking for in the way these teachers did it. With the recordings, one thing that was really important, we asked them to plan and record something that was a bit new. Especially if it was new for one person, or in a couple of cases we had somebody who'd taught it 3 or 4 years ago and they've come back into that year level and they wanted to sit down and talk about it again, and they've been 3 or 4 years out, the unit's moved on a bit, and as they sat down and recorded, they found that they were interrogating the other person's practice. Why has it changed? We used to do this. Oh yeah, we moved away from that. Why'd you move away from it? And it was in that interrogation of practice that really they came to understanding their own pedagogical reasoning. It also brought out some of their personal and professional identity. So there was a lot to this project about how we got the knowledge out and the way that it emerged from the students. One of the things that Schulman said that I said right at the start was he had 6 stages of pedagogical reasoning. I said 3 we consider reflective practice, and the first 3 were, who can remember? Comprehension, transformation, and instruction. Oh. Excellent. Some people have even written notes. Good work. Top of the class. Now, and they were fairly linear. Okay? We didn't see that. Conversations between people aren't linear. When you're sharing ideas, you're interrogating practice, something comes up and your mind jumps ahead and then you jump back. And so what we saw was, here's a diagram of a transcript of conversation to show you the sort of bouncing around of these ideas. So it started with some content where it says foci up here or content. They started with an idea about what they wanted to teach. And then they said, what could be the big ideas for this content? And so they jumped over to big ideas. And they started talking about what are the big ideas. And then they said, well, if they're the big ideas we're coming out with, we have to go back and rethink the content. Have we covered the content that we want to cover? If we just taught those big ideas that way. And then they said, well, do we have enough time for all now that we've got in the content? And so 3 came out as a constraint. Have we got enough lessons to do that? Do we need to prune? And so they came back to the big ideas. Do we have to take something out? And then they jumped over to curriculum agendas. Which bits are we covering? So it's more like the content. But then later on they come down to what's in it for the students, if we have student engagement. And then we jump back to big ideas. And then they came out to what are our values as teachers. And it was this sort of thing that kept coming up that brought out this idea of professional identity and personal identity. What you've lived yourself, the school you went to, those sorts of things, impact the way you teach. And so they bounced around on this diagram, okay? It wasn't linear. They didn't just start with what does it mean? Let's transform it, let's build an instruction. In fact, in building their instruction, they're bouncing around these focal concepts. We call this pinball reasoning. And it's an interesting topic because pinball reasoning hasn't got us very far in some of the literature. Because people go, doesn't make sense, how can it be so chaotic? It is pinball, but it's pinball in a fashion that is going somewhere. It always leads to something, and they know that at the end they have to do, have 8 lessons planned for science in year 8. They know that's got to be their end goal. But as they're getting there, they're jumping around and they're pinballing. So I want to give you tonight a bit of an insight into our data analysis, how we went through the data analysis and how we came up with some of these ideas. And I'm happy to talk about some of the things that came out of the project. So what I've got here is a bit of a transcript of a conversation between a couple of teachers. Okay, so I've taken this transcript and we've coded the transcript. So this isn't the exact transcript, we've actually taken some coding from it. So the first thing they talked about was big ideas. Then they talked about big ideas again, and then they got into constraints. So in this case, they're saying water is life. That was their big idea. And then they thought about the constraints. What are they up to? Where did they come from? What are they doing in other year levels? What can we do? And then they talked about some quality learning issues or some learning issues. What's the Wednesday program? How does it fit in with the whole school planner? All those sorts of things. How can we make this work? And they came back to big ideas. So here we've colour coded it. We found this was really useful. Red, big ideas, blue constraints, black, quality learning, and green, engagement. So we go through a few of those. You can see how the transcript sort of changes. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment. But I want to show you this. So when we take those colour codings and we start to put them on our diagram, this is what it looks like. They start with a big idea. Water is life. And then that was revised from last year. There was a new teacher in this group who hadn't taught it for a couple of years. So what do you mean you're going to do it, water is life? And then they went back, okay, we've agreed that's our big idea. Then the next thing they talked about was constraints and opportunities. What are the other year levels up to? What have they done in the previous year levels? Will they have enough background information? We need to know that. And then they started to talk about, but that links across the curricula. So we can start to link to other parts of the curriculum. What have they done? And then they came back to, what about links to other subjects? Does our big idea link? And then they came back, what about organising planning time, okay, for the students? And then they came back to, it's better to use big ideas than ticking off the AusVals outcomes, okay? They saw that as more purposeful for them and for their students. And then they said, oh, what about accountability? We've still got accountability in school, we still have to cover the content. That's a constraint. So I've got to go back and make sure that even with this big idea, we're going to cover all the content that we need to cover. What about our learning intentions? Are we going to cover them by using this big idea and doing this new unit the way we're planning to do it? Then they come down, what about when we went out and we had that excursion, we used the rock pool photos. They all had to take rock pool photos, this group. Now there we go, we can link that to this big idea about water is life. In quality learning, they can pick different water creatures, and that can be their topic. And so they can come back. They started sharing then. Sharing work between students was a route to engagement. And so I haven't done it all, but you can start to see that as this conversation goes on over 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, they're jumping around between these focal concepts. What we've noticed in doing a lot of this is the patterns and the way they move around these focal concepts is mediated by their professional and personal identity, the views they have of science and the ideas that they come back to. So another thing we wanted to do was, we said, well, if we're going to analyse the data in this way, what can we see? What can we see? So one of the things was, we started to say, well, let's pull out all of the big idea stuff. So we started to use diagrams like this. And what it showed us was how they went through the big ideas. So in this particular conversation, the big idea came up as the first idea that they discussed, and it was also the second idea they discussed, which was a new big idea. Then they talked about the big idea as number 8 in their conversation, and then as number 9. So there's this sort of pattern here in this one where big ideas clump, okay? Not always. Looking for the mouse again. Oh,
There it is.
got it. I've just got to work backwards here. So we go back, and then we can do the same with, say, constraints. We can look at how constraints came up. And so what we've been looking now, so constraints came up as 3, 12, 13 and 20. What we started to see were these sort of patterns in how constraints emerged in the data and big ideas and so on. I'm having trouble down.
It's got a mind of its own.
Just it's backwards to what I'm looking at. And then we can do the same with these others. So quality learning and big ideas again, and then engagement. Each of them come up with these patterns. But what did it mean for the teachers? So while we were researching about pedagogical reasoning and how pedagogical reasoning plays out, we were questioning what Schulman did. Now that's okay. As a research perspective, that was great. We found something very different to somebody who's a guru of science, of education generally, and we're questioning the sort of patterns and the model that he formed. But how did it help the teachers? What did the teachers get out of the project? Okay, we want them to research with us. Well, it was interesting because for many of them, it really helped them understand their classroom. And I can share a couple little stories about that. One story was there were 2 teachers sitting down organising a motion unit for Year 10 girls at an all-girls school. And they were saying how, you know, motion could be boring for girls. It's not like boys where you can do cars and crashes and it gets them excited and you can start engaging them in this sort of stuff. So they were thinking about, what do we do? How do we get these girls engaged? And so they were coming up with some constraints, but they managed to get around them. In the meantime, they had a person who sat in the class, in the planning meeting with them, and they were recording it. And at the end, they had their unit sort of mapped out, okay? And the other person said, "Oh my Lord, I've never seen that all this stuff goes on to that bit of paper you just put in the filing cabinet and say, this is what we've got to cover. All this thinking, all this stuff that you went through, all these ideas you had, things you rejected, then you took on. I wish I could see that more often." So this was a younger person who said, it was like, you know, open the blinds, I'm seeing the sun. And this is really important to us because Schulman's model says that you just sit down and you put the stuff on the page. And that's what a lot of teachers, younger teachers, think. But experienced teachers, they interrogate each other. And they really ask about what it means. How does it work for you? What am I supposed to do? And this was really enlightening for us, okay? It was a really enlightening moment. And so we've found that the teachers just have so much more knowledge about what they're doing by working through their pedagogical reasoning, being more explicit. We don't want the focal concepts to become a recipe. We don't want them to sit down there planning and go, oh, we have to discuss big ideas. Have we done that often enough? We have to do contextual constraints. Have we done that enough? We need to think about quality learning. Have we done that enough? We don't want them to do that. What we want them to do is have genuine conversations, but see that these are focal points that you can bring some stuff out in afterwards often. We're also mapping this to the professional standards of teaching. We think if teachers record these and listen and map it as we have done, that they'll have a much better understanding of why they do things. And if they get to the stage where they're having their professional performance review with their principal, and they're sitting down, they'll have a much better understanding of why they do things in the classroom. It won't be a matter of pulling out a worksheet and going, oh, look, this wonderful worksheet I've done. But they'll be able to talk in quite sophisticated ways about the learning that they plan for their students and why they planned the unit the way they did. Another teacher made a really interesting observation. We said, well, that's all well and good, but what would it look like if I came past your classroom and I saw you teaching this year compared to last year? Like, you've done all this work on pedagogical reasoning. What would it actually look like? What would we see that would be different? And she said, you know, if you came to my classroom, you probably wouldn't see too much different to what I did last year. But it's a bit like a duck on the water. She said, now my brain is just going 10 times faster about all the things that I'm thinking about. And there's just so much going on in my head, so much connections I'm making, so much more that I've thought about why I'm doing things. The other thing about the split screen thinking is what we've noticed with these teachers now is they start planning for the students to become better learners. They're thinking about how do they become better learners. So I'm going to do some work now so they understand not only what a concept map is, but why I might use a concept map. So that at the end of the year when I say, if you want to do revision, they go, oh, concept map could be good for that. It'll highlight some of the things I don't know. So that they're making decisions themselves based on stuff you did earlier in the year so they become better learners, right? Not just learning, it's about building quality learners. And that was a really important one in our discussion. So,
that's it.
I thought I had an arrow here somewhere, but I can't find it. So these are our ones that, as you can see there, these are contextual constraints and opportunities, big ideas, quality learners.
That's it.
Thanks for listening. Questions?
Many thanks, Kirsty and Deb. So over to you all. I know it's a bit roasty toasty in here, so I hope you're still with me. Because we are recording this to share with people beyond today, if you've got a question, pop your hand up. I'm going to give you the mic, and if you could stand up, that'd be lovely. And introduce yourself and tell us where you're from as well.
I can stand up.
Cam.
Kirsty, thanks for letting me ask a question, mate. I'm Cam Sensaga and I work here at John Monash.
Cam was also part of a program we ran for STEL, which most of these teachers came from.
Yeah, nice. So with this, it sounds to me like a lot of the discussions happened around team planning.
That's right.
So how does your model work when teachers are working in small, isolated communities and they don't have that opportunity to engage in team planning? And how do, I suppose, as an adjunct, how do you encourage team planning to happen more frequently?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting one because we think that at least in pairs you learn so much more by being able to interrogate somebody else's practice. It's really hard to ask yourself the hard questions about why I did that. And so we would encourage very much team planning. And I know that in some places you might be the only chemistry teacher in a small government high school. How do you get together with somebody else and look at what they do? I would go back to some of the old models and say it would be really useful to try and meet with somebody who's at another school and talk about it, because I think there'd be some interesting context around your students that might give you constraints and opportunities that would be different to them. And unpacking that might tell something about, you know, what you can and can't do. But also I think we've found it's very important to have people working in teams, in twos. We had one person turn up in the first year. It was really funny. She turned up to our session for the very first session in the first year, and she hadn't actually been invited, and she didn't realise it was an invite only. She'd seen the message go around, and she got a day off school, and she turned up. Anyway, she worked for about the first year with us, and she was really insightful. When she turned up the second year, she had her other member from staff tagged along. She said, "Can she join now? I need somebody to talk this through." And she'd actually been dragging this other person along with her because she found she couldn't really interrogate her practice or really get into the heart of her pedagogical reasoning without doing it with somebody else. And so what she was trying to do was just get this person to come in and ask her questions, and then they became a team, and the other person was the one who came along, and she showed some real insight, and she hadn't done the first 5 days. So it was a really interesting process. So we would really encourage the double up.
I just wanted to say, Cam, I think that's a really good question, because coming from an area in New South Wales at a regional university where you're working with country teachers, that was something that they would talk about all the time. And I hadn't really thought about, we know it's because they can't share, but maybe this is a lot of it, you know, is the fact that they don't have anyone to sit down with and interrogate someone, you know, another biology person or another chemistry person or another whatever. So it is quite difficult, but I hadn't really thought about it in that lens before. I know it's difficult and tricky, and how do we do that? And you know, ICT just doesn't cut it. Using technologies doesn't necessarily cut it for teachers, because there's still something about sitting down with someone in the room face to face and doing this stuff. And now that we've gone through and done it, it kind of makes a lot of sense. But I hadn't made that connection. So that's a good question.
Many thanks. The questions. I'll be right back to you.
G'day, my name is Mark Mcteer. I'm here at John Monash Science School. Thanks, Kirsty, Deb. 2 quick questions. One of them is, what did you do in the 5 days? What sorts of things were done in those initial 5 days of PD for the staff? And secondly, did you have any planning where you observed where students were involved in the planning and development of curriculum?
Yeah, great questions. The first 5 days were really interesting because we had an idea of what we thought the focal concepts might be, but they were loosely formed. So we wanted them to be students a bit. So we chose an area of science, in this case it was colour, and we taught them colour. And so they had a range of activities they worked through for the first half of the first day. And then we sat down, and Ian and I had sat down and recorded our planning of why we wanted to teach colour and what we thought were interesting problems, some of the issues we had. Now remember, they're half primary, half secondary. So one of the issues I kept saying to Ian was, we can't use big terms that primary teachers won't use. That's a constraint we have in teaching 2 groups together. So we went through it and we got them to listen to our tape and see if they could hear things that they thought were important in the way we were talking. And they actually came up with the 4 focal concepts from that first meeting. We have refined them a little bit since then, but basically they came up with quality learning, student engagement, big ideas and constraints in that sort of range. So that sort of told us that this was something useful that resonated with other teachers. So that was really good.
Other things that we did was that once we actually got some data, we got them to actually listen to tapes and actually try and identify the focal concepts and exactly what part of the tape was the focal concepts and kind of map it for themselves. In other words, putting them in our shoes as researchers. So it was and getting them to code as well and to deal with data, their colleagues' data. So they had lots of that as well to do. And
so what we did was, I think the 3rd and 4th day they came in,
yes,
and they planned a lesson themselves over an hour or so on the recorder, and they gave it to another group, and they took the other one. And then in building Try leadership back at school, they had to come up with, okay, if this was 2 of your teachers doing this, what advice would you give them about how they might grow a bit more or other things they might consider? And so it was sort of doing a questioning on what you heard in the pedagogical reasoning of the others. And then they sat down together, and one pair would sort of question the other pair about what their pedagogical reasoning was on the tape and give them advice, and then the other pair did it back to them. So we really did a lot of work on trying to get them to not only identify these, but be able to give feedback to a group. So we're in this mode of trying to build leadership in pedagogy. So yeah. What was the second part of your question? I've totally forgotten.
Were students ever involved? Did you observe that in any of the groups as they did lesson planning or unit planning?
Absolutely, in primary school, it's a given. And one of the things that was a bit controversial at the start was they didn't seem to think that there was important content in science that needed to be taught. It was more about starting with a big question or theme, and then the kids ask the questions and find the content within that. And they were quite happy to let the kids explore, and they thought that if they did that, they could guide them to the right and cover the content. Whereas in secondary, we're much more, we have a content agenda that's really important to cover, and we can't move too far away from it. So there was this real dichotomy of views, but I think both sides appreciated the views of the other and the constraints that they had. And because we had a thing about constraints and opportunities, people were able to talk about it in those terms without feeling that you're better than me or I'm better than you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. There was a question just here. I want to come back to you.
Oh, comment really. Just commenting that Debbie Shipson, currently CRTing, but leading teacher previously.
Thanks,
in different schools. Just commenting that there are biology networks and for other subjects as well where this does go on, and also online opportunities where you can conference with other teachers. I think part of the issue may be just time and what the school prioritises for allowing teachers opportunities for doing that, and perhaps it shouldn't always be after school when everyone's tired.
Absolutely, and a couple of things on especially the time. Some of the things we've noticed is a couple of our groups now talk about breaking down their science meetings and not doing admin every second meeting, just making it, let's talk about our practice. And that's been really important. I think if you want to really interrogate your practice, you need to know somebody. So I think you can do it in online forum if you've already known them. If you've worked with them for a couple of years and you moved away, you might be able to do it. I don't know that you do it with a stranger very well, because you need to be able to ask the tough questions of how they understand that working and the students learning it. Sometimes that can be a little bit confronting. But yeah.
It may be for someone of our age, let's say.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've done recent online learning where that was my only opportunity to speak to other people in the group, and also with my tutor. And so it's just a matter of push.
Yeah.
Right? So you do have to ask the hard questions because you need to know the answers.
Yeah.
So maybe just with some guidance as to what sort of questions to ask and where to probe.
And I think there's definitely opportunities. I mean, I'm an old Wimmera boy, and I came from Mcteer Secondary College. There was only 230 kids, and I was the only physics and senior maths teacher, really. And it was about networking with others in the West Wimmera cluster, you know. And when you had opportunities to get together, it was a lot of talk about what things you tried, what you did. But I often found that conversation was still generally activity-based, rather than getting into the deep nitty-gritty of why and how. And that's what we're trying to push with this.
Excellent, great, thanks.
And there's one there too.
Yeah, cool, I'll be back.
Hi, thanks for that. It was terrific. My name's Greg Ford, just recent graduate. I'm intrigued to the idea of the expert teacher. How did you identify these people as being expert teachers? And also the primary teachers, were they specific science teachers or were they generalist teachers?
Good question. Okay, on both counts. The expert teachers were teachers that had worked with the Catholic Education Office in a number of different professional learning programs. Mostly we were looking for teachers that we might have had contact with before, had done one of the programs that Kathy Smith knew about and knew them.
And was about science.
And about science. So
So
they
science
were
programs.
hand-picked people who we'd done some work with before and knew what their sort of thinking and how they worked and the sort of things that they did. None of the primary teachers were specifically science, so some of them had roles in their school as being the science leader.
Because I noticed that in my kids' school, they got funding for science and then they started to put generalist teaching in. They really have passion for the subject and it's kind of just fizzled out.
Yeah.
Well, this was a bunch of primary teachers who were really switched on about science.
Yeah. So they've been doing some really interesting things, and we've just had one in the last week doing some writing for us, who's secondary trained and has a PhD in education. So highly switched on primary teacher.
Great, many thanks, Greg. I'll just sneak in here.
Hi, I'm Stella, and I teach biology and
Hi,
health
Stella.
for southeastern suburbs Christian schools. And one thing,
Yes, sorry.
yeah, one thing that works well, this is for you, with the networking is emailing. If you form a committee, a teachers network, we have a health teachers committee. So we form a network and we talk to each other over or weekly newsletter kind of a thing. What worked best, and you just submit it to the leader, and the leader files it together and sends it off to all the teachers in the local school. So that worked very well with the health, VC health. And with biology, as Debbie was saying, she used to be my colleague before. So we worked together as well. So we formed again a biology teachers network, so that helped us teach as well as learn for the younger teachers. So we worked together in the schools and in the neighboring schools as well. So it worked very well. Thank you.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Happy to take some more.
Yep, great. I'll run around to you.
Hi, I'm a science student here at Monash with an interest of doing teaching after my degree.
Excellent.
I was just wondering how you could put this concept into actually teaching and like to jumpstart the process of thinking about collaborating with other students earlier, because I do know that I have friends that are teaching and they say they do a lot of planning by themselves, and especially when they're going into schools that the teachers just let them do it rather than discussing it.
Yeah.
That's just from personal experience.
It's a lovely question, and you're going to look like a plant in the audience now, because one of the things that we've done is we've just put in for our next ARC grant, and we want to take this and teach it to pre-service teachers. A couple of us, Lucy's been running something with our some of our core units in pre-service teaching, introducing pedagogical reasoning to them. And the feedback from the students is that this really helps me understand what teaching's about. So we also have a book, which is our pre-service teachers writing about their practicum when they're out on placement. And what we've done is we've put that against the headings in our focal concepts. So there's stories about how some of them grapple with different of the focal concepts while they're out on placement. So yeah, we're willing to sell that tonight. Yeah.
I think we could squeeze one more question. Anyone else?
Great question.
Okay, excellent.
We've scared them off.
Yeah, I know.
We've only got one book. We're not going to put any more in.
Just before I go into some thank yous and begin to thank our speakers, presenters, I really just want to let people know, the people that have been before realise this is a series of science seminars over the course of the year. This was the second in the series. We kicked off at Keysborough College and now we're here thanks to the team at John Monash Science School for having us. So pen in Thursday the 28th of July. Into your diaries. So without further ado, I would really like again to thank John Monash Science School for having us here, much appreciated. Thanks to our lovely marketing team and the faculty, Beck and Brandon, you've been amazing, thanks for that. Maggie, thanks for supporting us and with your AV work. And if you could join me again, please, in thanking Deb and Keast for their presentation.